there was a lot of information that we heard during these terrific sessions that we had. And in summing up, I'd just like to boil it down to 2 points. The first is we're here because of the Fisher decision, which really put us on a new path, a new emphasis on finding alternative means to get to racial diversity. Now, Tony made the point that, well, wouldn't it be more logical if your goal is to get racial diversity to just use race? But that's not where the Supreme Court is. And right, that was a 7-to-1 decision in which only Justice Ginsburg dissented and said, let's just allow universities to use race if racial diversity is the goal. 7 justices wanted to encourage universities to find other ways to get to racial diversity. So that's the first point. It was, and there was some back and forth this morning about how much pressure the decision places on universities, but the general direction, I think, is clear, that universities need to find new ways, if they can, to get racial diversity. And then the second big point, it seems to me, is that there are lots of exciting ways to get racial and ethnic diversity that might actually be better, that might broaden our view of what we mean by diversity and equal opportunity by looking at place, by looking at socioeconomic status. We heard about the number of states that have been doing exciting things, but I really want to underline once again Tony's research, because the figures are really quite powerful, and Tony explained them to you, but I think graphically it's important to look at. So right now, 11% of students are African American or Latino at the selective colleges. If you went to pure merit, that would drop to 5%. I don't think anyone's advocating that. If you use socioeconomic status, you're actually getting a greater level of overall representation of blacks and Latinos, so it's 13%. If you use kind of Cheryl Cashin's idea of place, the top 10%, that jumps further. If you combine the two, look at the power of this. If you combine socioeconomic affirmative action and a top 10% plan, kids who are testing in the top 10% of their high schools, we're talking about 23% representation for African Americans and Latinos compared to 11% today. So there are lots of interesting possibilities here. Now, people say, well, this is just a proxy, and on one level, that's right. But the beneficiaries, so we're looking at overall numbers of African Americans and Latinos, but the subset of African American Latinos who are benefiting from some of these new approaches is quite different than the subset of African Americans and Latinos who benefit from today's affirmative action program. 86% of the African Americans at selective colleges are middle or upper class. Now, the whites are even wealthier. And so we end up with a system like this, where rich kids outnumber poor kids at the selective institutions by about 14-1. That's with race-based affirmative action. And that's why at the Century Foundation we think that the Fisher decision presents not only a serious challenge to the use of race, but also an opportunity for us to think more deeply about diversity and how to change some of these figures. We certainly, I think most of us in the room do not think that the talent in this country is so heavily skewed toward the wealthiest segments of the population. So that leads me to the question of policy and what to do. Because the catch, of course, is that using these alternatives, which do benefit socioeconomically disadvantaged students, will be a whole lot more expensive than race-based affirmative action. The current policies are essentially quite conservative by bringing in upper middle class kids of all colors. And what we're talking about here is whether a conservative Supreme Court decision can actually push a very progressive result, which is to look deeper at these alternatives. So in the book we have two chapters on public policy proposals. One is written by Catherine Hill, the president of Vassar College, who's also a longtime economist and student of higher education, and Richard Sander, professor at the UCLA Law School. And together they put together kind of two buckets of proposals for public policymakers. The first is to create better systems of information, kind of building on Jessica Howell's research on undermatch, that it would be helpful for the government, perhaps in conjunction with foundations, to create a better way for universities to identify students who have a certain academic threshold, meet a certain academic threshold, and also would add socioeconomic and racial and ethnic diversity to those institutions. The second, and which I'll talk mostly about, is the importance of providing financial support for universities to move forward. So in her chapter, Cappy Hill talks about federal and state incentives to improve access for low-income students. Cheryl Cashin mentioned the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Cappy suggests that the problem is that all the incentives today are aligned against recruiting economically and racially diverse student bodies. You rise in the U.S. News and World ranking if you devote more resources to faculty, if you devote more resources to non-need merit aid. If you admit more low-income students, more students of color, you get no credit under U.S. News and World Report's rankings. And indeed, any money spent on low-income kids and financial aid can be seen as diverting funds from things that would increase your rankings. So all the incentives are aligned against low-income students. So she suggests that as a counter, there be federal and state financial incentives for universities who agree to admit more low-income and working-class students and work with them to make sure that they complete as well. Both Rick Sander and Catherine Hill talk about the need to modify antitrust proposals as well. This gets a little bit in the weeds, but there was during the Bush administration, there was an antitrust agreement which suggested that universities couldn't cooperate with one another in order to make sure that money goes to students who actually need it, and as opposed to merit aid. And they both call for re-examining that provision. As a result of the current policies, which the antitrust policies and kind of the incentives under U.S. News and World Report, we've seen a huge increase in merit aid under these policies. So you can see the green line are 1995 to 6 numbers, 2007 to 8 are the yellow lines, and you can see that need-based aid on the left is essentially flat over that time period. On the right, the non-need merit aid has increased dramatically at both public four-year institutions and private institutions, to the point where we've crossed this historical threshold where more students are receiving non-need merit aid today than are receiving need-based aid. So something needs to be done to provide incentives for universities to get that back in shape. Even though Cappy Hill is president of Vassar, she called for universities to step up as well and have the government require disclosure of net prices, but also the share of students from every income quartile. That's not information that's available right now. We know the Pell percentages at universities, but to get at the issues of inequity, you remember that slide suggesting the rich kids outnumber the poor kids by 14 to 1. The middle-class kids are also underrepresented, and so it would be helpful to have that information out there. She doesn't call for requiring income-based quotas or anything like that, but provide that and require universities to provide that information, and then see whether the institutions are living up to their public mission statements. A lot of those statements talk about the importance of education and in a democracy, social mobility, and this requirement would better align those two. She also calls for better support for students. So she's talking about better information for students, what Jessica Howell was talking about. She also suggests that by itself won't work because of the financial incentives that universities have now. So universities might discover there are all these diamonds in the rough who would do well at their institution, but if you're going to take a hit in the U.S. News rankings, they may not actually admit these students and provide the financial aid. And finally, along those lines, Catherine Hill talks about the need for more income-based loans repayments. So this is something the Obama administration has moved on to some extent, but there's a lot more that could be done in that area. There's a lot of research to suggest that low-income families are extremely reluctant to take on debt that to us would be the equivalent of taking on $1 million in debt in their eyes. And so income caps on the repayment would do a lot to encourage students to come. Finally, she talks about the need to step back and address the larger inequalities in our society. Her point is that income inequality at institutions of higher education essentially reflect the growing divisions that we have in our society at large. And so she calls for a number of programs, tax reforms, and wage policies to reduce inequality overall. I'll close with the question of whether any of this is politically feasible. We started with this notion that race-based affirmative action is under legal attack and it's under political attack. These initiatives against the use of race are almost always successful. The good news is that while voters don't like counting race and deciding who gets ahead in society, they also don't want our institutions of higher education to resegregate. And there's evidence, as Hallie Potter noted in her discussion, that in most states, they don't simply give up on diversity once race is disallowed. Instead, they find creative ways to bring about important changes. And we have, in fact, in very conservative states like Florida and Texas, governors who substantially increased financial aid because it was unacceptable for institutions to simply become all white and Asian. And so that's the flip side of the discouraging news about affirmative action is that the public does support stronger efforts to reach out to low-income students of all races. And ideally, we would reach Cheryl Cashin's dream of for those of us who are politically progressive, of finding a way to bring working-class whites, working-class African Americans and Latinos and Asians together to address some of these larger issues of inequality in our society. So I will stop there and turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Susan Johnson, who heads the diversity and inclusion effort at Lumina for her to close us out.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you all for your time today. This has been a phenomenal discussion, a very lively one at moments, and a very incredibly rich one where I hope that we've sparked your attention and your passion for this work. We've had phenomenal speakers and panelists and audience members that have offered insights on affirmative action and race-based versus race-conscious efforts. We've been asked to prepare for the possibility that some sort of ban will be passed in your state and to take a multi-pronged approach, coming to the aid of our presidents and applying more place-based efforts, being prepared to, again, offer those arguments up front. We've been offered data about the status of enrollments in our states and where race was banned and the adjacent states and the effect of those bans. We've suggested that using some combination of race, place, and SES could increase admission rates. And most importantly, I think we've shared our own personal experiences with regard to affirmative action and the work that we do on a daily basis. Ultimately, we have to call out and name race if we are to achieve true equity in higher education. As we close, I just want to offer 2 points that are mentioned in the book, and I know not everyone's had a chance to read it, but again, I definitely encourage you to take the time. Much of what has been offered today are items that you can use as you continue your work and go forward. But these 2 points I just want to point out, that there are 14 states representing nearly half of the total U.S. population that have a majority non-white toddler population. By the year 2025, the year of Lumina's goal, half of the nation's workers will be of Latino descent. So you see, this is an economic imperative, it's a social imperative, and really ensuring that all of these children, all of these workers have access to the kinds of post-secondary access and success and educational success that so-called traditional students have had for generations is really the imperative. It is the right thing to do for all of us. As Jamie stated earlier, we have to look beyond the recent cases and really create a new standard of educational achievement for all higher education institutions, one that meets not only our current needs but also our future needs. Again, I think I want to challenge all of us, all the influencers in this room, those of you that are listening online, to simply do more, to take advantage of the strategies you've heard here today, and to be models of and champions of what we term at Lumina as equity and excellence in higher education. Thank you all for coming today, and enjoy the rest of your day.